The name of this presentation is called Wheels of Fortune. Many, many years ago, I had the zchus to speak in the town of Gateshead in England. And when I spoke in the girls' seminary, one of the girls, a young lady, came over to me and she said, "Rabbi Krohn, I have a wonderful story about my father." Now, of course, wherever I go, people are telling me stories and, I try to listen to everyone. But her story was so unbelievable and so incredible, I couldn't imagine that it was really true. But I said, "Listen, I'm going back to New York soon. Give me the number of your father and I'll be very happy to call him." And I called him. His name was Shimon Paysach Zeitlin. But of course, when the story starts, he was not known as Shimon Paysach, but he was known as Sam Zeitlin. In 1965, he was a cyclist, a fabulous cyclist. And he won what was called the New York Sprint Championship. And he was known as the Jewish boy, the great cyclist. But unfortunately, in 1966, when he became part of the American national cycling team because of his talents, everybody knew that he was Jewish. And some of his teammates were very jealous and very angry. And there was anti-Semitism there. And they would make comments. And he told me that he would practice in a place in Queens called Casino Park. And there was a track there was a cycling track. And many times he could hear that his own teammates were saying nasty things about him. Now, he told me that he wouldn't travel by car from Brooklyn to Queens, but rather he had his bike. And when he finished in Casino Park, he would travel by bike to Brooklyn. He told me one late afternoon, after he had trained and worked on the cycling track with his bike, he was driving home and all of a sudden a car swerved towards him and he had to jump up on the sidewalk with his bike. And he turned around to see which car was that. And he realized that it was his teammates. And one of his teammates called out to him and said, "You'll never stay on top, you dirty Jew." And then he realized he's got to get out of here. For whatever it was, even though he loved cycling, and that was really his life, he knew that with this team, he could not possibly make it to the top. He told me that actually in '67, he went to Chicago, and there's a town there called Northbrook, Illinois, and there was the Grand Prix of the Americas. And it was a tremendous race. It was watched by many, many people. And he told me he was winning. He was coming towards the finish line. And he realized that he was going to be the winner. And he held up his hands. He took his hands off the handlebars. And he held up his hands as he crossed the finish line. And they disqualified him. He couldn't believe it. Why was he being disqualified? And they told him that there's a law that if you lift your hands off the bars before the finish line, in a sense, you could endanger all the spectators that are there by the finish line. Now, he checked it out afterwards. This was never enforced. So many people who had won races picked up their hands in victory. We always see those pictures. But they enforced that rule. And Sam Zeitlin was not considered the winner, even though he really was. And he knew he had to get out of America. In the cycling team and in the cycling circles, there were too many anti-Semites. So he was thinking maybe he should go to Canada, but it was too cold. And maybe he should go to Mexico, but the air was too thin, it was too high. So even though that he was not a frum Jew, but Israel was still his country. And he decided, you know what? He had appeared in the Maccabeah Games in 1965. He built up a reputation. He had won cycling contests. He decided he's going to go. And sure enough, he went that year, and it was the cycling division of Hapoel Tel Aviv Sports Club. And there he met the general manager, let's call him Nati. And Nati was so thrilled to see Sam because he knew Sam is a great cyclist. And that was the year that they were practicing to see if Israel could send a cycling team to the Olympics. They had never sent a cycling team. They just didn't have good enough riders. They had other competition that they were exceptional in, whether it was weightlifting and fencing and other things, but certainly not in cycling. And what happened was that he started practicing, and every day he would come, and Nati and the others would watch him, and they were so confident that one day they would reach that level where they could send a team to the Olympics. Now, one night, Sam himself decided he's going to go to the Kaisel. As I said, he wasn't frum, but when he was there, all he knew was Shema Yisrael. He kissed the wall, he kissed the stones of the Kaisel, and then he saw two frum-looking Bochrim, and he decided to go over to them. Now, it's incredible who these guys were. They were from Chicago. They were learning in Eretz Yisrael. One's name was Chaim Goldberg. Chaim at the time was a Talmud of Rabbi David Soloveitchik. And the other, you wouldn't believe it, was David Goldberg, who was learning by Rabbi Beryl Soloveitchik. Rabbi David Goldberg, Shlita, is today the Rosh Yeshiva of the Telz Yeshiva in Cleveland. Could you believe that? But at that time, he was a bocher, together with his brother. And they got into a conversation with Sam, and they saw that Sam is really serious. He wants to learn about Yiddishkeit. So now the Goldbergs, they come from Chicago, and they had a wonderful friend whose name was Rab Gershon Weinberger. Rab Gershon was an architect. He lived in Yerushalayim, and what happened was Rab Gershon's home was a home away from home from so many Bachrim that had come to learn in Eretz Yisrael. And for girls who were learning in seminaries, don't forget this whole movement of traveling to learn in Eretz Yisrael started after the 6-Day War. So that was in 1967. So now in the early 1970s, boys were coming, and of course it wasn't like today that there were so many places for Bachrim or girls to eat on Shabbos, and the Weinbergers had an open home. And this Miras Friday night, and the ambiance was so incredible. And there was one song that Rab Gershon Weinberger always sang, and the Bachrim that were there sang it together with him, and it went into the neshama of Sam Zeitlin. And that song was called Shabbos Hayom Lashem. Shabbos Hayom Lashem. And a whole week, he would always think of that niggin, and when he was cycling, he was always thinking of that niggin in his mind. And that became his anthem. Now, Rab Gershon began to realize that this Sam is really very serious. And in Eretz Yisrael, Sam decided he's not going to go by the name of Sam when he's with the frum people. He's going to go by his real name, which was Shimon Paysach. And one day, Rav Gershon Weinberger says to Shimon Paysach, listen, I have a friend who's starting a yeshiva in Bnei Brak. His name is Noach Weinberg. The name of the yeshiva is Magen Avram. Why don't you call him? I see that you're really serious about learning Torah and you want to become an Erlich Yid. I'm telling you, he'll accept you in his yeshiva. And wouldn't you believe it? You know what happened? That this Shimon Paysach was the 5th Talmud that Rab Noach Weinberg had in his yeshiva called Magen Avram. Eventually, Magen Avram from Bnei Brak moved to Yerushalayim and became Eish HaTorah. But Shimon Paysach was the 5th Talmud of Rab Noach Weinberg. Now, while they were in Bnei Brak, Shimon Paysach told me he was so happy because in Yerushalayim, when you are practicing, we know there's so many hills in Yerushalayim, but in Bnei Brak, it's a more flatter terrain. And he would ride on the highways behind these huge trucks that were carrying tanks. And of course, like I say, it was after the 6-Day War, so there were many tanks that were being brought to different places in Eretz Yisrael. And with the aerodynamics, and he would be able to cycle behind these trucks, and he would go up hills and down hills and flat terrain during the rain, and he was practicing. And you know what Rab Noach told him? He told me, Shimon Paysach told me. Rab Noach said, listen, I want you to learn every day first aid in the yeshiva, but every day you got to practice for 3 hours. He said, could you imagine if you make it to the Olympics and you win a medal and you're standing there with your yarmulke and the whole world sees a frum guy won a cycling medal? That would be a tremendous Kiddush Hashem. That would be amazing. And that's what he was striving for. And he worked very, very hard. Now, one day they announced that the training for the team would be on Shabbos, the trials. The Israeli Sports Federation, the trials were going to be on Shabbos. Now, Shimon Paysach told me that he had tried to get some of the cyclists to come to the Geisel to be a little bit more from, it didn't help. And when he heard that the trials were going to be on Shabbos, he went to the general manager. He said, you know, I'm a Sabbath observer. I'm a Shemesh Shabbos. I can't do the trials. He said, well, then you're not going to be on the team. He said, what are you talking about? You know I'm the best cyclist. And you know that if I don't join your team, there's no way you're going to be able to send a team to the Olympics. Because you know that I'm a world-class cyclist. And Nati said to him, listen, we're not changing the rules for anyone. And now, Shimon Paysach told me he was in such conflict. For years, he's practicing. And the 1972 Olympics were coming up. And Eretz Yisrael was going to send teams, as I said, in weightlifting and fencing and rifle shooting. And they wanted to send for cycling, but they're not going to send if there's not even a chance of winning. And they would not change the rules. And Shimon Paysach told me he was so torn, but he decided he's going to be a Shemesh Shabbos. As he was going to continue. He was not going to take those trials. And you know something? Eretz Yisrael in 1972, in those Olympics that were in Munich, Germany, they did not send a cycling team. They did send a weightlifting team, they did send a fencing team, and a rifle shooting team. And some of you who know the history, I remember when it happened. Rachmana litzlan, the Palestinian guerrillas came and they attacked the village, the Olympic village, and they killed 2 Israeli athletes. And they took 9 Israeli athletes as hostages in helicopters. And they took the helicopter to an airfield in Munich. And the German police, it's always been debated whether they did a smart thing or not, but they got into a gunfight with the Palestinians. And the Palestinians blew up the helicopters, and Nebuch killed 9 Israeli athletes. The whole world was shaking from that. And Shimon Paysach told me he was back in Bnei Brak. And when he heard Nebuch, that now 11 Israeli athletes had been killed, all he could think about was this miras, Ki esh mera Shabbos, Kel yishmereni. Ki esh mera Shabbos, because I observed Shabbos. The Rabbi Shalom watched me. He felt awful for those athletes, but he knew in his heart that the only reason that he was saved was because he didn't go to those trials and they didn't send a cycling team, because he always sang that song, Shabbos Hayom Hashem. The wheels of fortune had turned in his way, that he met Reb Chaim Goldberg and Reb David Goldberg, and he met Reb Gershom Weinberger and Reb Noach Weinberg, all great people that were really his true coach in life, not Nati. But because of that, he was zeicha to become an Erlich Yid. He raised a wonderful family, and I am always grateful to his daughter in Gateshead. Of course, now she's in America, for telling me this story, because we see Ki Eshmer Shabbos, Kel Yishmereni.